This is Phoenix, and I'm going to read a chapter from my book, Contorted Royal. Um, the chapter is called Everything is Blue, What One Brandon Knew. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and read it. Alright, I hope you enjoy. Brandon knew that there was another one of him out there, somewhere, in an alternate universe, one that was modern, where the storyline was completely different. There, Brandon was a victim of mental illness, where his beautiful insights were seen as deplorable, even though they were so dang correct. There, Brandon was a kid. There, Brandon suffered because everything was death. While Brandon wasn't going to pretend that wasn't the case with him, his viewpoint seemed to be a little more, how did he want to put it, open to interpretation, a little bit more exuberant, less depressed, less focused on the negative. That didn't mean Brandon didn't think everything was death, because he did. It was just that, based off the trajectory of his life path and where he had ended up, he had a little bit more appreciation for certain things. Not everything, of course. There was still death aplenty, but that didn't mean that Brandon was going to live his life as a life-deprived kid. He was an optimist, at least, as often as possible, and while optimists were unreliable and untrustworthy, that was who Brandon was. Brandon was walking through the castle of Contorted Royal, trying to get to the court, where he could talk to the Suicide King. As he was walking, he was humming to himself, a mindless tune that he loved. He was reminiscing on the beauty of the color blue. There were so many hues of that color blue. They were all equally beautiful, of course, from the world Brandon came from, in the same planet as Contorted Royal, but not in the same region. Brandon was definitely an outsider. Everything was blue, and blue of the different hue. He loved it when he saw the royal blue, or the cerulean blue, or the light blue, or the sky blue, etc., etc. He knew it wasn't just his eyes that were the problem when it came to seeing such a colorific emblem. He knew it dealt with the fact that everything literally was blue. Not everything, of course, certainly not Contorted Royal, but things were blue. Brandon missed those days, but alas, he knew that there were things he needed to do, what one Brandon knew. A lot of things did he need to do. He was a man on a mission. No, that was incorrect. He was a kid on a mission. He wore clothes of the average servant boy, sky blue to complement the sad fire of his eyes, even though he wasn't really a servant himself, though he was fine identifying himself as a servant and others calling him a servant. He was like this because that was his style. He liked the idea of being humble. He liked the idea of being the servitude of society. He liked the idea of putting himself below others, certainly not in a deprecatory way, though. More like just out of a kind gesture toward others. But Brandon wasn't going to be speaking lightly about the things that were on his mind. He had no plan to. Everything was blue, what one Brandon knew. He finally arrived at the court. The Suicide King was flirting with the sword, but thankfully, so as most likely not to traumatize Brandon of which the Suicide King hadn't seen yet. He wasn't murdering himself in a violent passion. He was singing a song about suicide to himself, and he was having a certainly good time. It was, however, clashing and crashing deeply against the song that Brandon was humming, singing for himself, to the point to where it saddened Brandon. He just didn't get why people couldn't share the same tunes. The Suicide King's singing was self-indulgent, and while Brandon didn't want to see himself as a superior by any stretch or length of the imagination, Brandon's tune was certainly more simple, rustic, humble, and perhaps with shades of love above. The Suicide King would probably beg to differ, of course, because people always differed, but for Brandon's humble sanity, he needed to see it that way. He needed to see himself as the poor servant boy, just trying to make it, even though Brandon was far superior to any of that. "Excuse me, your Royal Highness, but in Contorted Royal there's a certain dryness." The Suicide King dropped his sword, as though caught in the act. He had been preparing to gut-wrench it, straight into his gut, which naturally wouldn't have been pleasant. He turned to Brandon with a blank stare at first, but then a cruel smile slowly formed on his lips. "Another servant come to clean up after the wounds of the wounded king, like the Fisher King, though of course in other parts of the body. We have no use for fertility around here," said the Suicide King. "If that's how you want to address me, your Royal Highness, though in Contorted Royal there's a certain rawness," Brandon said. "I see people bleeding because of murder. I see men that want to hurt her. I see a world where chaos struck all people, stuck in the pool, the Grim Reaper pool. It's rather unpleasant to see, if you don't mind me saying so, my lord. Well, you're wrong, kid. About everything. Literally, of course, about everything. There is nothing wrong with Contorted Royal. Everything here works the way it needs to, like flawless clockwork. So if you wouldn't mind, would you please allow me to finish what I was doing? I would appreciate that very much so, he added a little sardonically. Everything is royal blue, what one Brandon knew, Brandon said, and turned sideways. The Suicide King was interested in what Brandon said, but had to shift his position to be on equal footing, to be even with Brandon, because of his position. He looked carefully at Brandon and said, "What did you say?" "It's only a matter for your pleasing, though I'll confess there is some teasing," Brandon said. "Everything is blue, you say?" said the Suicide King. "Is that what you said?" "Certainly not here, Mr. King, sir." "Certainly not here. Here everything is awfully violent red. But where I came from, everything is a calm and serene blue. It's rather full of serenity, like getting lost in divinity. Where I come from, we have little use for loneliness. Violence is seen as unnecessary in many contexts, and the world just makes more sense. But it's this blasted Contorted Royal that screws things up. A lot, I must admit. It's like Contorted Royal is stuck in Hell's Pit. Yes, so it is. Everything is death. But in that death there is a catch." "For someone who speaks so eloquently, why are you dressed in mere peasant clothes?" asked the Suicide King. "Because for me they're rather pleasant," replied Brandon simply. "I have no use to be a peasant. Even though, I'll confess, I'm lower than a peasant, where I come from. But it affords a lot of happiness. You've probably realized by now I don't come from your land." "Where do you come from, then?" the Suicide King asked. "From a land far away, though from where I cannot say. Everything is perfectly blue, what one Brandon knew. You're probably wondering what I know, so ask before I go." "Yes, I'm absolutely curious." There was some derision in the Suicide King's phrasing, but also some curiosity, and perhaps a tinge of compassion. "Fix Contorted Royal. I would start by getting rid of all the fakeness, where people like me can't adjust. Contorted Royal is beyond screwed up, without a doubt, and you must throw all the violence out. You," Brandon said, addressing the Suicide King personally, who quietly mouthed, "Me?" as if Brandon was a very powerful being who'd finally noticed the Suicide King. "Would do well to hang up your sword and stop fighting the sides of yourself that you don't get. The Black Queen needs to stop being so disconnected from you and buying into the vanity myths of Contorted Royal. I'd advise the Jack of Knives too, but I rather like his style, and I don't see what good that would do. You're the head, though, and you keep chopping it off. Perhaps there's something you can do about that?" "I wish there was," the Suicide King said gravely, "but my sword is all I've got." "Well, a lot of the violence in this kingdom stems from your actions," Brandon said. "I'm amazed you haven't realized that." The Suicide King descended to Brandon's level. Brandon and the Suicide King were suddenly face to face. The Suicide King grabbed Brandon's clothes in a panic, a crippling fit of anxiety, and said, "I know it does. I know it does. But selfishness, it's in my nature. I couldn't change it even if I wanted to. I want everything to be blue rather than that atrocious red you describe. But alas, I just don't know how. I'm a violent, violent soul." "Well, you aren't to blame completely, of course," Brandon said. "Contorted Royal would have issues even if you weren't so suicidal. But it would certainly help if you were well. You aren't a very good example. I think suicide has its uses, of course, but not the way you appropriate them. Your version of suicide is the same as a slutty boy, while handsome as hell and extra virgin, sleeping around with a million girls to make himself feel better. All it does in the end is make you feel empty." "Empty," the Suicide King said. "I see what you mean. Emptiness." "Contorted Royal is a very sick place," Brandon said. "It should be hospitalized at once. I know, however, that you won't do that. You don't have the means to do so. You don't have the budget, a host of reasons. All of that is perfectly understandable. But Contorted Royal, as it stands, is constantly contorting itself, contortions of pain and distortion. You can't go down that route forever. I'm sure you're aware. Or at least I would hope so. As I've said before, it's not necessarily what the people of Contorted Royal do that's so bad. I rather find your suicidal tendencies rather admirable, but they aren't sacrificial gestures by any means. They're completely self-absorbed. Vanity, pointless destruction, rampant hostility, that characterizes the supposed medieval kingdom, with many mental problems that have been left untreated for far too long. Mental problems are okay, of course, but it's how it's dealt with here. It's just plain problematic. Well, thank you for your input," the Suicide King said, and paused for a moment. He had let go of Brandon long ago, and he looked at the sword and went right back to it, picking up his addiction. "I see your point of vanity." "How it's really just insanity," Brandon said. "I just thought I'd pass the word along. What you do with it is completely up to you, of course. You do what makes you happy. But while I'm here, I'll confess I'd like to see some changes. And is there anything else you'd like to see while you're here? The Suicide King said irritably. There is, Brandon said. I'd like to talk to Alice. Oh, Alice, came the Suicide King. We love Alice. I'm sure you do, Brandon said, but she's still not living the life of the Queen, especially when considering her gifts. I intend to talk to her when the time is right, which I imagine will be very soon. I hope that's okay. That's completely fine, the Suicide King said. You won't be changing me, but you can definitely talk to Alice. Well, thank you, Brandon said. I've spoken my mind, and that's all one can do when speaking with a tyrant. I hope now it's okay that I exit. The Suicide King gave a half-baked gesture of dismissal, and Brandon bowed gently, then walked out of the room. He heard the Suicide King groaning and thinking inside, saying things like, "A boy with manners," and "He's wrong, but what if he's right?" and "What should I wear?" Brandon knew it would take more than a rhyming speech to get things going, but that was okay. He expected that. He in fact didn't really expect things to change. What he knew for sure was that he needed to find Alice, talk to her, comfort her, let her know of her gifts, which, despite her special treatment, were still being dismissed. Brandon smiled at this. Yes, he talked to her when the time came. Again, this is Phoenix, and that was from my novel Contorted, and I hope you enjoyed it. Again, thanks.